this point, the simple question of why do we use SSH keys may have crossed your mind, and that's a perfectly fair question to ask. Certainly, you are probably aware of all of the problems that are involved with passwords, from the challenges of remembering just your username, let alone the password itself, from having to frequently change passwords for security purposes. The SSH key access, once it's been configured properly, actually makes connecting and authenticating much, much easier than the password process. The other problem with password access is that it's very easy to take on somebody's identity. So as long as you have that right username and password combination, which aren't very long and complicated strings typically, you can get access and authenticate yourself as somebody else on a server. With the SSH protocol, unless you have that private key, and again, fundamental concept here is don't share that private key, at least not a user private key, with anybody else. As long as you keep control of that, nobody else can authenticate as you, because your public key can be in a number of different places, and you can use that same private key to authenticate all over the place, and it is still secure as long as you maintain control of that private key. Another thing that is beneficial about SSH over some of the previous communications protocols, things like Telnet or RLogin, where the earlier protocols would send stuff in clear text. So if you could intercept that stream, either between devices or by compromising a router or something like that, you could potentially just collect the data and read what was going across the wire, or you could potentially even change the message en route and send something that was not correct to or malicious to the final destination. So the fact that the authentication process and authorization process are encrypted, and then the subsequent communications are protected by the encrypted SSH tunnel, makes this a much more robust way to deal with transmitting, both authenticating users and transmitting data across the wire. SSH protects against a lot of things that earlier protocols did not, and even potentially simplify the process of authentication and certainly make it much more secure and robust compared to passwords. But they don't protect you against everything. So again, if you configure your SSH process incorrectly, if you have your public key on your computer and put your private SSH key out on the server, this is bad. Then things will not go well in that case. If somebody actually has access to your root account and can get access to that private key, again, a bad situation, and not having your directory secured. So keeping control of your primary device, keeping control of your private SSH key becomes very, very important. But as long as you do that, SSH is much, much better than using either older communications protocols or passwords.
So by now you should have the idea firmly ingrained in your mind that there are two keys involved in the SSH process, and you have the private key and the public key. The private key, absolutely don't share it. That's the bottom line. That's the end of the message, and you will hear me say this over and over again, because public keys do end up on occasion getting exposed. The important thing to realize is if you have exposed your private key in some fashion, the correct thing to do is delete it and replace it anywhere. Replace your public key with a new private public key pair anywhere you had used that old one. It's so easy to regenerate these keys, and the potential pain down the road of private key being used to access your private systems is just not worth the pain. We'll come back in a minute to a caveat to that, but in terms of the private key that sits on the machine, your laptop, your desktop computer, the server that machine you use to connect to any other system, should always be kept close to the vest and not shared. End of story. Public keys by default are designed to be shared. They are designed to be put out in the public. You don't necessarily want to, post them on your social media feed. And if you, for some reason, wanted or needed to do that, the password generation process or the key generation process comes with the option to use a password. This is not always enabled, and in some programmatic instances it's inadvisable because it just defeats the purpose of automating things. But we'll get to that in a second. The main thing is that your key potentially should have a password on it if you feel that it might get exposed or be subject to attempts to get access to it. The exception to the rule is that you can use use the SSH protocol in some cases to automate systems, or there's the possibility of using a system called a bastion host, where you use your public private key pair to get access to a remote server, and then on that remote server you have another public private key set up, and basically use that secondary, often virtual device as a means for accessing systems, and you give it certain amounts of authority, and it's quite possible that you don't have a passphrase on that. And this is one instance where that bastion host, you still would use best practices to avoid it being compromised, but in this case you may well have a private key sitting out on there. But you have to realize that the use is different. So the stuff that is yours, that you want to keep absolutely secure, at the very least put a password on it, and like I said, your personal keys should not be shared, or your personal private keys should not be shared.